Chapter 6 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 6, Emancipation Proposed and Postponed. Military events underwent great fluctuations in the first half of the year 1862. During the first 3 months, Union victories followed each other with a rapidity and decisiveness which inspired the most sanguine hopes for the early and complete suppression of the rebellion. Cheering news of important successes came from all quarters: Mill Springs in Kentucky, Roanoke Island in North Carolina, Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, Pea Ridge in Arkansas, Shiloh in Tennessee, Island No. 10 in the Mississippi River, the reduction of Forts Jackson and St. Philip on the lower Mississippi, the capture of New Orleans in Louisiana, and finally what seemed the beginning of a victorious advance by McClellan's army upon Richmond. In the month of May, however, this tide of success began to change. Stonewall Jackson's raid initiated a series of discouraging Union reverses, and McClellan's formidable advance gradually changed into an unnecessary retreat. No one noted this blighting of a longed-for fruition with a keener watchfulness and more sensitive suffering than did President Lincoln. As the military interest and expectancy gradually lessened at the circumference and slowly centered itself upon the fatal circles around the rebel capital, his thoughts by day and anxiety by night fed upon the intelligence which the telegraph brought from the Union camps on the Chickahominy and the James. It is safe to say that no general in the army studied his maps and scanned his telegrams with half the industry, and it may be added with half the intelligence, which Mr. Lincoln gave to his. It is not surprising, therefore, that before the catastrophe finally came, the President was already convinced of the substantial failure of McClellan's campaign as first projected, though he still framed his letters and telegrams in the most hopeful and encouraging language that the situation would admit. But aware of the impending danger, he took steps to secure such a reinforcement of the army and provide for such a readjustment of the campaign as might yet secure the final and complete victory which had lain so temptingly within McClellan's grasp. A part of this program was the consolidation of an army under Pope. The culmination of disaster doubtless came sooner than he thought possible. McClellan himself did not seem apprehensive of sudden danger when on June 26 he telegraphed, "The case is perhaps a difficult one, but I shall resort to desperate measures and will do my best to outmaneuver, outwit, and outfight the enemy. Do not believe reports of disaster, and do not be discouraged if you learn that my communications are cut off and even Yorktown in possession of the enemy. Hope for the best, and I will not deceive the hopes you formerly placed in me." This was the language of a man still possessing courage and faith, but the events of the 2 days following robbed him of both. Early on the morning of the 28th, he sent the Secretary of War his memorable telegram already quoted, which was a mere blind cry of despair and insubordination. "I have not a man in reserve, and shall be glad to cover my retreat and save the material and personnel of the army. If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or to any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." The kind and patient words with which President Lincoln replied to this unsoldierly and unmanly petulance, and the vigorous exertions put forth by the War Department to mitigate the danger with all available supplies and reinforcements, have been related. The incident is repeated here to show that the President and Cabinet promptly put into execution a measure which had probably been already debated during the preceding days. The needs of the hour and Lincoln's plan to provide for them cannot be more briefly stated than in the two letters which follow, the first of which, written on this 28th day of June, he addressed to his Secretary of State. It was evidently written in a moment of profound emotion produced by McClellan's telegram, for nowhere in all his utterances is there to be found a stronger announcement of his determination to persevere unfalteringly in the public and patriotic task before him. My view of the present condition of the war is about as follows. The evacuation of Corinth and our delay by the flood in the Chickahominy have enabled the enemy to concentrate too much force in Richmond for McClellan to successfully attack. In fact, there soon will be no substantial rebel force anywhere else. But if we send all the force from here to McClellan, the enemy will, before we can know of it, send a force from Richmond and take Washington. Or if a large part of the Western army be brought here to McClellan, they will let us have Richmond and retake Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, etc. What should be done is to hold what we have in the West, open the Mississippi, and take Chattanooga and East Tennessee without more. A reasonable force should, in every event, be kept about Washington for its protection. Then let the country give us 100,000 new troops in the shortest possible time, which, added to McClellan, directly or indirectly, will take Richmond without endangering any other place which we now hold, and will substantially end the war. I expect to maintain this contest until successful, or till I die, or am conquered, or my term expires, or Congress or the country forsakes me, and I would publicly appeal to the country for this new force, were it not that I fear a general panic and stampede would follow. So hard is it to have a thing understood as it really is. I think the new force should be all, or nearly all, infantry, principally because such can be raised most cheaply and quickly. This letter was, of course, not needed for the personal information of Mr. Seward, but was placed in his hands to enable him to reassure those who might doubt the President's courage and determination. The other letter, written in advance and dated the 30th, was addressed to the governors of the loyal States. It ran as follows: The capture of New Orleans, Norfolk, and Corinth by the national forces has enabled the insurgents to concentrate a large force at and about Richmond, which place we must take with the least possible delay. In fact, there will soon be no formidable insurgent force except at Richmond. With so large an army there, the enemy can threaten us on the Potomac and elsewhere. Until we have reestablished the national authority, all these places must be held, and we must keep a respectable force in front of Washington. But this, from the diminished strength of our army by sickness and casualties, renders an addition to it necessary, in order to close the struggle which has been prosecuted for the last 3 months with energy and success. Rather than hazard the misapprehension of our military condition and of groundless alarm by a call for troops by proclamation, I have deemed it best to address you in this form. To accomplish the object stated, we require, without delay, 150,000 men, including those recently called for by the Secretary of War. Thus reinforced, our gallant army will be enabled to realize the hopes and expectations of the government and the people. Armed with these letters, Mr. Seward proceeded hastily to New York City. The brief correspondence which ensued indicates the progressive steps and success of his mission. On this same 30th of June he telegraphed to Secretary Stanton, "Am getting a foundation for an increase of 150,000. Shall have an important step to communicate tonight or tomorrow morning. Governors Morgan and Curtin here, and communicate with others by telegraph. Let me have reliable information when convenient, as it steadies my operations. Will you authorize me to promise an advance to recruits of $25 of the $100 bounty? It is thought here and in Massachusetts that without such payment recruiting will be very difficult, and with it probably entirely successful." To this the Secretary of War replied on the following day: "The existing law does not authorize an advance of the bounty. Discreet persons here suggest that the call should be for 300,000 men, double the number you propose, as the waste will be large. Consider the matter. The President has not come into town yet. When he arrives, you will receive his answer." Later in the day he added to the above: "The President approves your plan, but suggests 200,000, if it can be done as well as the number you mention." It is probable that a further discussion, and perhaps also further information of the retreat and despondency on the Peninsula, brought more fully to the minds of the President and Secretary of War the gravity of the crisis and the need of decisive action. For Mr. Stanton sent a third telegram to Mr. Seward, saying: "Your telegram received. I will take the responsibility of ordering the $25 bounty out of the 9 millions appropriation at all hazards, and you may go on that basis. I will make and telegraph the order in an hour. The President's answer has already gone." Mr. Seward's answer to this was all that could be desired under the circumstances. The governors respond, and the Union Committee approve earnestly and unanimously. Let the President make the order, and let both papers come out in tomorrow morning's papers, if possible. The number of troops to be called is left to the President to fix. No one proposes less than 200,000. Make it 300,000 if you wish. They say it may be 500,000 if the President desires. Get the $25 advance fixed, and let the terms be made known. Accordingly, on the morning of July 2, there appeared in the newspapers a formal correspondence purporting to be the voluntary request of 18 governors of loyal States to the President, that you at once call upon the several States for such numbers of men as may be required to fill up all military organizations now in the field, and add to the Army heretofore organized such additional numbers of men as may in your judgment be necessary to garrison and hold all of the numerous cities and military positions that have been captured by our armies. All believe that the decisive moment is near at hand, and to that end the people of the United States are desirous to aid promptly in furnishing all reinforcements that you may deem needful to sustain our government." To which the President's reply announced: "Gentlemen, fully concurring in the wisdom of the views expressed to me in so patriotic a manner by you in the communication of the 28th day of June, I have decided to call into the service an additional force of 300,000 men." "It was thought safest to mark high enough," said Mr. Lincoln in a private telegram to Governor Morgan of New York, while in another private circular to all the governors he explained his desire a little more fully: "I should not want the half of 300,000 new troops if I could have them now. If I had 50,000 additional troops here now, I believe I could substantially close the war in 2 weeks. But time is everything, and if I get 50,000 new men in a month, I shall have lost 20,000 old ones during the same month, having gained only 30,000 with the difference between old and new troops still against me. The quicker you send, the fewer you will have to send. Time is everything. Please act in view of this. The enemy having given up Corinth, it is not wonderful that he is thereby enabled to check us for a time at Richmond." It was doubtless the sudden collapse of McClellan's Richmond campaign which brought President Lincoln to the determination to adopt his policy of general military emancipation much sooner than he would otherwise have done. The necessity of a comprehensive rearrangement of military affairs was upon him, and it was but natural that it should involve a revision of political policy. The immediate present was provided for in the call just issued for 300,000 volunteers, but he had learned by experience that he must count new possibilities of delays and defeats, and that his determination, so recently recorded, to maintain this contest to ultimate triumph, compelled him to open new sources of military strength. He recognized, and had often declared, that in a republic the talisman which wrought the wonders of statesmanship and the changes of national destiny was public opinion. We now know that in the use of this talisman he was the most consummate master whose skill history has recorded. We are justified in the inference that his foresight had perceived and estimated the great and decisive element of military strength which lay as yet untouched and unappropriated in the slave population of the South. To its use, however, there existed two great obstacles: prejudice on the part of the whites, the want of a motive on the part of the blacks. His problem was to remove the one and to supply the other. For the first of these difficulties the time was specially propitious in one respect. In the momentary check and embarrassment of all the armies of the Union, generals, soldiers, and conservative politicians would tolerate reprisal upon rebels with forbearance, if not with favor; and for their consent to the full military employment of the blacks he might trust to the further change of popular sentiment, the drift of which was already so manifest. The motive which would call the slaves to the active help of the Union armies lay ready made for his use. Indeed, it had been in steadily increasing action from the beginning of hostilities till now, as far and as effectively as the Government would permit. McClellan's change of base was effected on the 1st of July, 1862. Lincoln's final appeal to the border States took place shortly afterwards on July 12, and his vivid portrayal of the inevitable wreck of slavery in the stress of war doubtless gathered color and force from the recent military events. Already, before the border State delegations gave him their written replies, he knew from their words and bearing that they would in effect refuse the generous tender of compensation, and he decided in his own mind that he would at an early day give notice of his intention to emancipate the slaves of rebellious States by military proclamation. His first confidential announcement of the new departure occurred on the day following his interview with the border State representatives, and is thus recorded in the diary of Secretary Welles. On Sunday, the 13th of July, 1862, President Lincoln invited me to accompany him in his carriage to the funeral of an infant child of Mr. Stanton. Secretary Seward and Mrs. Frederick Seward were also in the carriage. Mr. Stanton occupied at that time for a summer residence the house of a naval officer some 2 or 3 miles west or northwesterly of Georgetown. It was on this occasion and on this ride that he first mentioned to Mr. Seward and myself the subject of emancipating the slaves by proclamation, in case the rebels did not cease to persist in their war on the Government and the Union, of which he saw no evidence. He dwelt earnestly on the gravity, importance, and delicacy of the movement, said he had given it much thought, and had about come to the conclusion that it was a military necessity, absolutely essential for the salvation of the nation, that we must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued, etc., etc. This was, he said, the first occasion where he had mentioned the subject to any one, and wished us to frankly state how the proposition struck us. Mr. Seward said the subject involved consequences so vast and momentous that he should wish to bestow on it mature reflection before giving a decisive answer. But his present opinion inclined to the measure as justifiable, and perhaps he might say expedient and necessary. These were also my views. 2 or 3 times on that ride the subject, which was of course an absorbing one for each and all, was adverted to, and before separating, the President desired us to give the subject special and deliberate attention, for he was earnest in the conviction that something must be done. It was a new departure for the President, for until this time, in all our previous interviews, whenever the question of emancipation or the mitigation of slavery had been in any way alluded to, he had been prompt and emphatic in denouncing any interference by the General Government with the subject. This was, I think, the sentiment of every member of the Cabinet, all of whom, including the President, considered it a local domestic question appertaining to the States respectively, who had never parted with their authority over it. But the reverses before Richmond and the formidable power and dimensions of the insurrection, which extended through all the slave States, and had combined most of them in a confederacy to destroy the Union, impelled the administration to adopt extraordinary measures to preserve the national existence. The slaves, if not armed and disciplined, were in the service of those who were, not only as field laborers and producers, but thousands of them were in attendance upon the armies in the field, employed as waiters and teamsters, and the fortifications and entrenchments were constructed by them. Within the next 4 days, Congress finished its business and adjourned, the Confiscation Act being an important part of its final work. The President, as we have seen, signed the bill with its amendatory resolution, and the Government was thus brought face to face with the practical duty of enforcing its provisions through military directions and orders in further detail. It has been explained how the Confiscation Act and other laws broadened and multiplied the forfeitures of title to slaves for the crimes of treason and rebellion. We have the evidence of the President's written comments that he considered these penalties just and the imposition of them constitutional. In the administration of the laws thus enacted, there therefore remained to be examined only the convenience of their practical enforcement and the general effect upon public opinion of the policy they established. We have no record of the specific reasoning of President Lincoln upon these points. We only know that within the 5 days following the adjournment of Congress, July 17 to July 22, 1862, his mind reached its final conclusions. The diary of Secretary Chase contains the following record of what occurred at the Cabinet meeting at the Executive Mansion on July 21. I went at the appointed hour and found that the President had been profoundly concerned at the present aspect of affairs, and had determined to take some definite steps in respect to military action and slavery. He had prepared several orders, the first of which contemplated authority to commanders to subsist their troops in the hostile territory; the second, authority to employ negroes as laborers; the third, requiring that both in the case of property taken and of negroes employed accounts should be kept with such degrees of certainty as would enable compensation to be made in proper cases. Another provided for the colonization of negroes in some tropical country. A good deal of discussion took place upon these points. The first order was universally approved. The second was approved entirely, and the third by all except myself. I doubted the expediency of attempting to keep accounts for the benefit of the inhabitants of rebel States. The colonization project was not much discussed. The Secretary of War presented some letters from General Hunter in which he advised the Department that the withdrawal of a large proportion of his troops to reinforce General McClellan rendered it highly important that he should be immediately authorized to enlist all loyal persons without reference to complexion. Messrs. Stanton, Seward, and myself expressed ourselves in favor of this plan, and no one expressed himself against it. Mr. Blair was not present. The President was not prepared to decide the question, but expressed himself as averse to arming negroes. This Cabinet discussion came to no final conclusion, and we learn from the same diary that on the following day, Tuesday, July 22, 1862, which was regular Cabinet day, the subject was resumed. Further conference was had on organizing negro regiments, but Lincoln decided that the moment had not yet arrived when this policy could be safely entered upon. Secretary Chase wrote, "The impression left upon my mind by the whole discussion was that, while the President thought that the organization, equipment, and arming of negroes like other soldiers would be productive of more evil than good, he was not unwilling that commanders should at their discretion arm for purely defensive purposes slaves coming within their lines." But on the kindred policy of emancipation, the President had reached a decision which appears to have been in advance of the views of his entire Cabinet. Probably greatly to their surprise, he read to them the following draft of a proclamation warning the rebels of the pains and penalties of the Confiscation Act, and while renewing his tender of compensation to loyal States which would adopt gradual abolishment, adding a summary military order as Commander-in-Chief, declaring free the slaves of all States which might be in rebellion on January 1, 1863. The text of this first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation is here printed from the President's autographed manuscript. In pursuance of the 6th section of the Act of Congress entitled An Act to Suppress Insurrection and to Punish Treason and Rebellion, to seize and confiscate property of rebels, and for other purposes, approved July 17, 1862, and which act and the joint resolution explanatory thereof are herewith published, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, do hereby proclaim to and warn all persons within the contemplation of said 6th section to cease participating in, aiding, countenancing, or abetting the existing rebellion or any rebellion against the government of the United States, and to return to their proper allegiance to the United States on pain of the forfeitures and seizures as within and by said 6th section provided. And I hereby make known that it is my purpose upon the next meeting of Congress to again recommend the adoption of a practical measure for tendering pecuniary aid to the free choice or rejection of any and all States which may then be recognizing and practically sustaining the authority of the United States, and which may then have voluntarily adopted or thereafter may voluntarily adopt gradual abolishment of slavery within such State or States. That the object is to practically restore, thenceforward to be maintained, the constitutional relation between the General Government and each and all the States wherein that relation is now suspended or disturbed, and that for this object the war as it has been will be prosecuted. And as a fit and necessary military measure for effecting this object, I, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, do order and declare that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any State or States wherein the constitutional authority of the United States shall not then be practically recognized, submitted to, and maintained, shall then, thenceforward, and forever be free. Of the Cabinet proceedings which followed, the reading of this momentous document we have, unfortunately, only very brief memoranda. Every member of the Council was, we may infer, bewildered by the magnitude and boldness of the proposal. The sudden consideration of this critical question reveals to us with vividness the difference in mental reach, readiness, and decision between the President and his constitutional advisers. Only two of the number gave the measure their unreserved concurrence even after discussion. It is strange that one of these was the cautious Attorney General, the representative of the conservative faction of the slave-holding State of Missouri, and that the member who opposed the measure as a whole and proposed to achieve the result indirectly through the scattered and divided action of local commanders in military departments was the anti-slavery Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Chase, representing perhaps more nearly than any other the abolition faction of the Free State of Ohio. All were astonished except the two to whom it had been mentioned a week before. None of the others had even considered such a step. But from the mind and will of President Lincoln, the determination and announcement to his Cabinet came almost as complete in form and certain in intention on that memorable Tuesday of July as when 2 months later it was given to the public, or as officially proclaimed on the succeeding New Year's Day, an irrevocable executive act. A fragmentary memorandum in the handwriting of Secretary Stanton shows us distinctly the effect produced upon the assembled council. The manuscript is here reproduced as nearly as the types conveniently permit. The very form of the record shows the Secretary's strong emotion and interest in the discussion. Tuesday, July 22. The President proposes to issue an order declaring that all slaves in States in rebellion on the certain day of certain year, the Attorney General and Stanton are for its immediate promulgation. Seward against it argues strongly in favor of cotton and foreign governments. Chase silent. Wells. Seward argues that foreign nations will intervene to prevent the abolition of slavery for sake of cotton. Argues in a long speech against its immediate promulgation, wants to wait for troops, wants Halleck here, wants drum and fife and public spirit. We break up our relations with foreign nations and the production of cotton for 60 years. Chase thinks it's a measure of great danger and would lead to universal emancipation. The measure goes beyond anything I have recommended. The omissions in this bit of historical manuscript are exceedingly provoking, but some of them are supplied by President Lincoln's own narrative, recorded and published by the artist F.B. Carpenter, whose application for permission to paint his historical picture of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation called it forth. "It had got to be," said he, Mr. Lincoln, "midsummer 1862. Things had gone on from bad to worse until I felt that we had reached the end of our rope on the plan of operations we had been pursuing, that we had about played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game. I now determined upon the adoption of the emancipation policy, and without consultation with or the knowledge of the Cabinet, I prepared the original draft of the proclamation, and after much anxious thought, called a Cabinet meeting upon the subject. All were present, excepting Mr. Blair, the Postmaster General, who was absent at the opening of the discussion, but came in subsequently. I said to the Cabinet that I had resolved upon this step, and had not called them together to ask their advice, but to lay the subject matter of a proclamation before them, suggestions as to which would be in order after they had heard it read. Mr. Lovejoy was in error when he informed you that it excited no comment excepting on the part of Secretary Seward. Various suggestions were offered. At this point we interrupt the President's relation a moment to quote in its proper sequence the exact comment offered by Secretary Chase as recorded in his diary. I, Chase, said that I should give to such a measure my cordial support, but I should prefer that no new expression on the subject of compensation should be made. And I thought that the measure of emancipation could be much better and more quietly accomplished by allowing generals to organize and arm the slaves, thus avoiding depredation and massacre on one hand and support to the insurrection on the other, and by directing the commanders of departments to proclaim emancipation within their districts as soon as practicable. But I regarded this as so much better than inaction on the subject that I should give it my entire support. The President continues, Mr. Blair, after he came in, deprecated the policy on the ground that it would cost the administration the fall elections. Nothing, however, was offered that I had not already fully anticipated and settled in my own mind until Secretary Seward spoke. He said in substance, "Mr. President, I approve of the proclamation, but I question the expediency of its issue at this juncture. The depression of the public mind consequent upon our repeated reverses is so great that I fear the effect of so important a step. It may be viewed as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching forth its hands to Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching forth her hands to the government." His idea, said the President, was that it would be considered our last shriek on the retreat. This was his precise expression. "Now," continued Mr. Seward, "while I approve the measure, I suggest, sir, that you postpone its issue until you can give it to the country supported by military success, instead of issuing it, as would be the case now, upon the greatest disasters of the war." Mr. Lincoln continued, "The wisdom of the view of the Secretary of State struck me with very great force. It was an aspect of the case that, in all my thought upon the subject, I had entirely overlooked. The result was that I put the draft of the proclamation aside, as you do your sketch for a picture, waiting for victory." Instead of the proclamation thus laid away, a short one was issued 3 days after, simply containing the warning required by the 6th section of the Confiscation Act. The already quoted military order to make seizures under the act had been issued on the day when the proclamation was discussed and postponed. Meanwhile, the Government, by its new military arrangements, sending reinforcements to McClellan, organizing a new army under Pope, and calling Halleck from the West to exercise a superior and guiding control over a combined campaign towards Richmond, seemed to have provided the needful requirements for early and substantial success. End of chapter 6.